Some new focus on the head of the EPA as she publicly mulls an end run around Congress. The agency moving to fulfill President Obama's pledge to push his climate change agenda with or without the consent of lawmakers. Doug McKelway live in Washington with more. Doug?
Afternoon, Greg. President Obama said earlier this summer that he would not wait for Congress to act on climate change. And if there was any doubt that he really meant it, EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy laid it to rest this week.
He said that he wasn't going to wait for Congress, but that he had administrative authorities, and it was time to start utilizing those more effectively in a more concerted way.
Even some critics are applauding the administration's strategy of bypassing Congress. Listen up.
There is no way the American public would support a UN treaty or a climate bill. That is why the Obama administration is being strategically brilliant by doing this behind the scenes in essentially a nameless, faceless bureaucracy in Washington.
But maybe not. A federal judge this week dealt a potentially big blow to EPA in a suit brought by the Landmark Legal Foundation. He ruled that EPA's responses to FOIA requests seeking information about alias email accounts that EPA officials used, quote, contain numerous inconsistencies and reversals which undermine confidence in their truthfulness. And now 2 members of Congress have written former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson demanding all of her personal emails over the last 4 years that relate to her official duties. EPA officials have said that alias accounts were used to prevent being overwhelmed with emails, but critics fear they were meant to hide politicized science about global warming. Indeed, it appears from recent comments by Interior Secretary Sally Jewell, the administration will tolerate no dissent about global warming.
I hope there are no climate change deniers in the Department of the Interior.
What they're saying is, if you are a global warming skeptic and you work for the Obama administration, either by appointee or by a career civil service, you better keep your mouth shut and you better not express your views.
But dissent is growing, prompted in part by new measurements that show that global temperatures have stalled for the last 15 years. Greg?
Doug McKelway in Washington. Doug, thanks. Jamie?
All right, appreciate that, Doug. And it does raise a bigger question about what the EPA's plan to skirt Congress on this means for American workers. Dan Henninger is the deputy editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal. Julian Epstein is a former chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee, former staff director for the House Government Reform Committee. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be here.
Dan,
thanks for having us.
First of all, what does it mean for the energy industry in general if the president goes ahead and does this without Congress?
Well, it's been commonly called the Obama war on coal, and it would basically mean the end of the utilities industry that depends on coal. The idea would be to somehow transfer them over to part coal and part gas. But coal-fueled utilities would basically be put out of existence. And this creates tremendous political problems because you have a lot of coal either being used or produced in states all across the Midwest and in the South. And you're talking about a lot of employment in those utilities. So, you know, Gina McCarthy, the EPA administrator, says that it's a false choice between economic growth and climate control. But she's given no evidence whatsoever that that the EPA can avoid massive layoffs across the electric utility industry if they pursue this war on coal.
And Julian, before you answer that question or see that impact, do you have to really take a closer look at whether or not climate change exists? The president is insisting, as is the EPA director, the time to act is now because these emissions are increasing. He recently said that it's in the last 10 years, it's increased to levels where action's necessary. But some argue, critics argue, that it's a weather anomaly. It's not climate change. And actually, the numbers have remained fairly stable.
Well, actually, we've seen emissions increase 3% in the last year. 2000 to 2010 was the hottest decade on record. 2010 was the hottest year on record. The National Academy of Sciences, which is the most prestigious scientific body in the world, says that 97% of global climate change experts are in agreement that climate change is created by humans and that it has potentially catastrophic effects and that we need to act now. That's point one. Point two is, I would disagree with the setup piece that says this is an end run around Congress. In 2007, the Bush administration was slapped down by a very conservative Supreme Court who said that they failed. The EPA under the Bush administration failed to act under the Clean Air Act to reduce carbon emissions. In 2011, when the Obama administration issued regulations for automobiles, a very conservative circuit court affirmed those regulations in very, very strong terms. And here it seems to me what the administration is doing is, one, fully within their statutory authority. I suspect that there may be a challenge to the regulations if they're adopted. I suspect they won't be successful.
But Julian, let me bring this to your attention too. The EPA itself says that greenhouse gas emissions have only risen 1% since 2005. So Dan, why don't you weigh in on Julian's disagreement with your argument?
Well, the point of his argument that I would really like to disagree with is that I think it is an end run around Congress. I mean, by this logic, they could have implemented the entire Affordable Health Care Act by regulation. And what he's talking about here is the president's Climate Action Plan, which he announced at Georgetown in June. The Climate Action Plan is an enormous reorganization of the energy industry. It's an enormous reorganization of a large part of the American economy. That should properly be sent through Congress. But they won't do that because they know there are too many Democratic senators from these coal-producing states who won't vote for it. That's difficult, but that's the system that the Founding Fathers set up. The Founding Fathers did not create a parliamentary system or a monarchy that just puts things like this in place by fiat.